Another thing that a literate slave could do is literally write their own freedom papers, right? So, a literate slave was considered to be potentially a dangerous. And the slaves understood the importance of an education. They saw the little white children going to school, and they made the logical connection that said, if getting an education is important for the little white child, then it's of equal value to me. It's important that I should get an education as well. And this was one of the areas where uh, once slavery ended, all over the South, black schools began to pop up. Now, many of these early black schools were sponsored by the United States government. There was a government agency called the Freedmen's Bureau. All right. And the Freedmen's Bureau had a number of tasks. One was to make sure that the former slaves had jobs, that they became self-sufficient economically. Another purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to make sure that Southern whites didn't abuse the former slaves. But another purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to educate the freedmen's children. And so, all over the South, Freedmen's Bureau schools come into existence. Now, those schools don't last long, 4, 5, 6 years max. But during that time, many of the children of the former slaves receive their fundamental education, right? The 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? As a matter of fact, oddly enough, excuse me, itchy nose. Oddly enough, the parents, the parents understand the importance of an education for their children, but they also understand the importance of an education for themselves. And so in these Freedmen's Bureau schools, over and over again, you read about not only is the room full of children, but the room is full of the parents of the children, because they want to be able to read and write and do simple arithmetic as well. But probably the most important thing to the former slaves, the question is, what did the former slaves want? Okay. Probably the thing that they wanted the most was land. Now remember, the vast majority of the slaves had worked they were farmers. They worked in the fields. They were good at it. And that didn't change now that they were free. The knowledge was still there. I have a strong opinion about this, and other historians agree with me. So see what you think. I am convinced that we know that there is still a lot of friction between white America and black America. I personally am convinced that the reason that the reason we don't get along any better than we do is because black Americans were forced by circumstances to remain poor. And one of the things that was used to keep black Americans poor was to keep them from owning land and to force them to become sharecroppers, and then to take advantage of the sharecroppers economically. Now, I'm going to devote another lecture to that idea, but for right now, let's just leave that there and continue talking about land ownership. Land ownership is one of the most precious rights that Americans have. not just land ownership, but the ownership of property generally, and specifically land ownership. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's true. That's what he said. But that's not what he said to begin with. That's what he said after it had been edited. The original draft manuscript of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson said life, liberty, and property. And the other members of the committee who had been assigned to write a declaration said, "Well, Tom, why don't let's don't be quite so specific. Let's just make a general term and let's just call it the pursuit of happiness." He agreed. Property ownership has always been such an important part of the American character because, remember, at the beginning of our country, everybody was a farmer. Just about everybody was a farmer. Even the people who lived in New England where the farming was difficult, stony, weak, thin soil, they were out there raising corn and wheat and all that stuff too. And America remained an agricultural society up until around 1900. That blows the minds of many of my students. But the value of exported agricultural goods, now listen carefully, the value of exported agricultural goods was more than the value of exported manufactured goods up until 1900. So we were still an agricultural economy at the beginning of the 20th century. The ownership of land, it was thought, and I agree, gives the property owner certain values. It makes you independent, doesn't it? You can raise what you want to raise. You can look at the market and you can say, "I'm going to raise bell pepper this year because I can make more money for a bushel of bell pepper than I can for a bushel of wheat." Okay? So it gives you independence to make your own economic decisions. And it gives you you become self-sufficient. You raise on your farm what you and your wife and your family need to survive. So independence and self-sufficiency come with land ownership. Now, after the Civil War, and I'm not a big conspiracy theorist guy, right? You know, but in this case, there was a real legitimate conspiracy. White property owners, and the whites owned all the property. White property owners really got together and they agreed not to sell land to any black man. Because to do so would be to admit that the black man was the equal of the white man. And we can't have that, can we? Because we got to maintain this fiction of white superiority. But nevertheless, we're not going to sell any land to a black man. Now, the black man, what is his talent? Farming. What does a farmer need? Land. The black farmer now cannot buy land. So what does he do? He does the second best thing. He becomes a sharecropper. All right, let's devote the rest of this lecture to sort of a comparing and compare and contrast between the way sharecropping should have worked and the way that it actually did work. Okay, here we go. The sharecropper, let's call him that, right? The cropper, would get together with the property owner, and between the two of them, they would make several decisions. First of all, they would decide how many acres the sharecropper's farm would have. And generally, that decision was based on what are you going to grow, right? Some crops require more acreage than other crops. Sometimes the size of the farm was based on the size of the sharecroppers' family, right? Because the assumption was that all the family members would be helping on the farm. And so a sharecropper with 6 children probably might be given more land than a sharecropper that only had 3. That sort of makes sense, right? So they would decide on the size of the farm. Generally, it sort of just worked out like this. The size of sharecropper farms were divisible by 40 or multiples of 40. 40 acres. You've heard of 40 acres and a mule, haven't you? Well, that's sort of where that come from. 40 acres, 80 acres, 120 acres, 160 acres. Okay. So they would decide how big the farm was going to be. Then they would decide what the crop was going to be. Are we going to raise tobacco, rice, sugar, cotton? What's it going to be? Well, the reality is that certain crops, as I mentioned, need more land than other crops. But nevertheless, they would decide what the crop. Okay, so we decided how big the farm was going to be. We decided what the crop is going to be. Then they would decide how will the money be. No, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Then they would decide what kind of help is the property owner going to give to the sharecropper. And this varied from owner and sharecropper to owner and sharecropper. Some owners, for example, might provide, they would provide a mule and all the harnesses, the ropes, the plows, the discs, the tools, the shovels, and the hose. They would provide all of that stuff. Others, not so much. The idea was that the more equipment that was provided by the owner, the greater his share at the end of the year would be when the profits were divided up. Now, the typical sharecropper didn't have a penny to his name. By their very nature, sharecroppers were poor. And so, what would happen is that the property owner would accompany the sharecropper into town and they'd go to the local general store. And the owner would introduce the sharecropper to the merchant and vouch for him and say, "This is Bill. He's farming 40 acres for me outside of town. Now, can you provide him with all the things that he needs to survive, as he doesn't have any money? Can you provide for him the things that he's going to need to survive until the crop is harvested and it's sold?" And the merchant would say, "Yeah, sure." And so the sharecropper would live on credit at the general store until the crop was sold. When the crop was harvested and sold, the first person to get their cut of the money was the property owner. And like I said, based on how much he had contributed would determine how much what his share would be. The more he had contributed, the greater his share would be. All right. Then the sharecropper would take the money that's left over, and he would go to the merchant, and he would pay his bill, right? And what is left over is the profit. That's sort of capitalism at work, isn't it? Now, what I just described to you is the way sharecropping should have worked. It didn't quite often it didn't work like that, because people took advantage of the sharecropper. The property owner took advantage of him. The merchant took advantage of him. Okay, how? All right, so here's the second scenario. Very similar to the first one. The cropper and the property owner would get together and decide on what the farm size would be. And then, and very little change between the second and the first scenario. Then they would decide uh, how they were going to divide the profits. Oh, I forgot about this in the first scenario. They would decide how the profits would be split. In other words, based on the property owner's contribution, maybe the profits would be split 50-50. Right. The cropper would get 50%, and the property owner would get 50%. Or maybe the property owner didn't contribute nearly as much. Well, in that case, the sharecropper would get a little bit more. Maybe the split was 60% for the cropper, 40% for the property owner, and they would do that in the second scenario. They would decide what the crop was going to be. They decide what the size of the farm was going to be. They would decide what the split was going to be at the harvest time. Okay, they would go into town in a similar fashion. The property owner would introduce the cropper to the merchant. They would make arrangements for credit. Now, this is where things began to go bad for the sharecropper. Many of the merchants had a two-tier pricing system. You walk into that store and you pick what you want to buy and you pay cash for it. He would charge you a certain price. But if you walked into the same store and you bought the same stuff and you said, charge it, he would charge it, but he would charge you a different price, a higher price. So you are being penalized already, aren't you? By using credit rather than cash. The items that might cost you an item that might cost you a dime if you paid cash might cost you 11 cents if you're charging it. Now, that doesn't sound like much until you figure out that it's 10%, right? A 10% difference simply because you are charging, you're putting it on credit. So, if you are charging it, if you're living on credit, that means that your bill is automatically probably going to be bigger than if you were going to pay cash. So, the harvest rolls around. And let's assume that you're raising cotton, right? And your 40 acres or your 80 acres has produced, let's keep this simple, a bale of cotton. And that bale of cotton weighs 500 pounds. And people are getting 10 cents per pound, right? So 500 pounds, you do the math, right? 50 bucks. 50. So the property owner gets his cut of the 50 bucks first. Then the cropper goes into town to settle with the merchant. And the merchant tells him that you owe me X. And the cropper pays that amount and he keeps the difference, and that is his profit. But this is where something else quite often happens. Remember that the sharecropper is uneducated. He doesn't know math, for example. He doesn't know how to multiply 10 cents per pound times $500, times 500 pounds to get 50 bucks. He doesn't know that. Who does he depend on to do the math? Well, he depends on the merchant. And what if the merchant cheats him? What if the merchant says, first of all, the going rate, now, in our scenario, the going rate is 10 cents a pound, right? What if the merchant says the going rate is 9 cents a pound? He's lying. But the cropper doesn't know. And so what does the cropper make on the transaction? 450 bucks instead of 5. So the merchant has automatically cheated him out of money. What would happen if the sharecropper suspected? He couldn't prove it because he can't do the math, but he suspects that he's being cheated. What can he do? Well, there's very little that he can do. What would happen to that black man in Alabama if he accused the merchant of cheating him? Well, a lot of things could happen to him, and none of them are good, right? He could have been beaten, he could have been lynched, he could have been whatever. And so, in many cases, even though he might have a really good idea that he's being cheated, he really can't say so because the consequences of making that accusation in the South, we don't even want to think about the ramifications. And so, in many ways, at every turn, the black sharecropper is being taken advantage of or outright cheated. Now, let's throw another issue into this lecture. We have the mistaken idea that all sharecroppers were black. And that is absolutely untrue. I don't know where that came from, but it's certainly not true. Most sharecroppers were white. Now remember, there were a lot more poor whites than there were poor blacks, simply because there were more whites than there were blacks. I mean, the statistic analysis would indicate that that's a true statement, and it is true. There were a lot more white sharecroppers than there were black sharecroppers, and uh, the mechanics of sharecropping were similar for white sharecroppers and black sharecroppers. For example, the white cropper would get together with the landowner, and they would decide on the size of the farm, and they would agree what the property owner is going to supply, and they would agree on what the split was going to be. 60-40, 50-50, whatever. They would go to town, and the property owner would introduce the white cropper to the local merchant and set up an account. And then at the end of the harvest season, this is where the difference begins to set in. At the end of the harvest, the chances were likely that the property owner was not going to cheat the white cropper simply because, what's the operative word here? White, right? Because they were white. They felt guilty about cheating people who were just like them. And if the owner did try to cheat the cropper, what could the white cropper do? The white cropper could complain, couldn't he? He might say, look, I'm not really comfortable with the numbers and the weights and all that. Could we bring in a neutral third party to double check your figures? And then they would call in maybe the local minister down at the Baptist church, right? Or the local banker, somebody who had integrity, someone who was honest. And so the white cropper could do things that the black cropper could not do. He could get away with things that the white cropper could not do. The same thing applied down at the general store when it became time to settle up down there. Quite often, even though the merchant was going to take advantage of the white cropper too by charging a different price for the stuff that was on credit, the amount that he charged might be less, right? Instead of charging 10%, he might only charge 5%. He's still ripping off the cropper, but the rip-off is not quite as large. Plus, now the white cropper is just as ignorant as the black cropper. He doesn't do the math. He can't add up these long columns of numbers to figure out what the debt is. The black cropper has to trust the merchant because if he complains, something bad's going to happen. But the white cropper can speak up, can't he? He can say, I'm not sure about these numbers. And he can do the same thing. Let's call in the pastor. Let's call in the banker. Let's call in somebody to double check the figures. And so, in many ways, white and black croppers operated in similar ways, but in a lot of ways, the white cropper had an advantage over the black cropper. Now, that's just an overview of sharecropping. Sharecropping would continue in the South well into the 20th century. This is not a 19th century phenomenon. It started in the 19th century, but it certainly didn't end in the 19th century. It doesn't end. Many historians say that it doesn't really end until the appearance of machines used in farming. For example, tractors and hay balers and all of those things that don't require a lot of labor. One guy can operate a tractor with a set of discs behind it. You don't need a horse. You don't need all the gear, the bridles, the ropes. You don't need all of that stuff. You just jump on the tractor, put gas in it, and go. And many historians say that sharecropping continued in the South until the advent of mechanization made it cheaper to mechanize than it did to have humans out in those fields doing that work. Many of your grandfathers, maybe if it's not your grandfather, certainly your great grandfathers, if you're from the South, and if you come from a family like mine that was rather poor, there's a real good chance that you, whether you're white or whether you're black, it's a good chance that that ancestor was a sharecropper at some point. And may I make a suggestion to you? Check with the older members of your family. Ask them, did you ever do any cropping? And if they did, get out your iPhone, hit record, and record that conversation. And let me listen to it, because I would love to hear that stuff, right? Because those people are dying, aren't they? They're not going to be, there are so few of them left today, and they are dying left and right. And we are getting ready to lose that historical connection to our past here in the South. Now, there was another downside to sharecropping that I've not really mentioned, but let me do that. Remember what the desires of, and now we're back to talking about, especially the black sharecroppers. Remember what their desires were? They wanted an education for their children. They wanted to go to church, right? All that stuff. They wanted land. Well, land never, in the 19th and into the 20th century, land ownership was not really something that happened for Southern black farmers. If you were a Southern black farmer, the chances were likely you were a sharecropper. Because you were being cheated left and right, you're being cheated by the property owner, you're being cheated by the merchant. That means that the amount of cash that you put in your pocket is a lot less than it should be. If you had not been cheated, your profit would have been greater. Now, I'm not saying that you would have been able to live like a rich man, but life would not have been such a struggle if you had just not been cheated. But you were. And as a result, when you would go to the merchant to pay off your debt at the end of the year, he would tally everything up and he would say, "Oh, Bill, I've got some bad news for you. You didn't have enough money to pay off your debt. You've paid me all you got, but you still have not satisfied your debt. You still owe me $15, right?" And then he would say, "But Bill, I know you're a good man. You're a deacon at the First Baptist Church here in town. I know that you're good for your debts. What I'm going to do, because I like you, I'm going to carry the balance forward to the next year. I'm going to permit you to operate on credit for another year. And maybe next year, your harvest will be better and you'll be able to not only pay off all of your debt, but you'll have some left over. Let's hope that that's what happens." Well, it never happens, right? Because what happens is the debt gets larger because they're still cheating you left and right. And the amount of the debt just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And states pass laws that prohibit sharecroppers from abandoning their land and abandoning their debt to move somewhere else to make a fresh start. If they can find you, they will put you in jail. So the croppers are sort of trapped, aren't they? It's not going to get any better. It's just going to get worse. Now, remember that one of the goals of the former slaves was to get a good education for the children. Well, that didn't happen because as the debt that at the general store increased, the black sharecroppers were forced to pull their children out of school to work on the farm. The logic was that we have more people working on the farm, we'll make more money. Well, that didn't happen either because everybody continued to cheat them. And fundamentally, what happens is that the debt becomes so great down at the general store that the black sharecropper is forced to pull his children out of school to work on the farm, which doesn't work either. But the bottom line is that because the kids are no longer in school, what happens? Ignorance sets in. Now, let me say again, you've heard me say this before. Let me say it again. Being ignorant and being stupid are two different things. If you're stupid, you can't learn, right? We all know stupid people. But if you're ignorant, that just means that you're uneducated. You've not been taught. And so these children who are forced to drop out of school are not stupid. They're smart, but they are uneducated. They're ignorant. Okay, so we've got that. And the bottom line for most sharecroppers, white and black, but especially black, is a spiral of increasing ignorance and increasing poverty as the years go by. They literally cannot get out of debt, and they literally are unable to afford to send their kids to school. And so the kids grow up ignorant, and everybody is living in poverty. Let's get back to something I said earlier. I said that I am convinced that it's sharecropping that contributes to many of the race relation problems that we have today. Let me explain that. During the Civil War, as General Sherman's army swept through the South, one of the things that Sherman did when he got to South Carolina, the white property owners on the South Carolina plantations had fled. They had moved away. As the Federal Army got closer, the white property owners ran away. And Sherman then took these plantations and divided it up into 40 and 80 and 160 acre farms and gave the land to the slaves who had been to the people who had once been slaves on that plantation. Makes sense, doesn't it? It does to me. But when Lincoln heard of what Sherman had done, he contacted General Sherman and said, "Oh, God, no, don't do that. Put it back the way it was. Don't give them ownership of that land. Pay them wages for working on the land, but do not give them the land because that is un-American." And Sherman, being the obedient soldier that he was, did what he was told to do by Lincoln. Now, here's my theory, and other historians agree with me. And isn't it wonderful when somebody agrees with you? My theory is that the alternative to land ownership for Black Americans was sharecropping. What else could they do? That's all they knew to do was farming, right? But because they were being cheated left and right, they could never get out of this economic hole that they were digging themselves into. And poverty and ignorance was the result. Poverty and ignorance are two evil things, folks. I say that at the end of the Civil War, with the South on its knees, this would have been the perfect opportunity for the United States government to engage in what we like to call land reform. Now, in this case, what would land reform do? It would take those big farms, those big plantations, and do what General Sherman had wanted to do in South Carolina: divide them up into reasonably sized farms, give one of those farms to every black adult male, and create this self-sufficiency and independence that we talked about a few minutes earlier. I believe that would have created a strong black middle class much earlier than it long before the time it took to create a black middle class. It would have come into existence earlier, and it would have meant much more economic independence, and it would have also done away with much of the white on black violence that takes place. And in the long run, it would have meant less racial friction between white and black Americans than still exists today. Now, I believe that with all my soul. If you can prove me wrong, please go ahead, because I am teachable. But because of a lack of land reform, when it could have been done, there was only a narrow window when it could have been accomplished, and it wasn't. And by the time that door shut, we were back to the same old, same old. Whites had taken their property back, and now they were dividing the farms. That's true, but they were dividing it up, not giving the land to the blacks, but they were dividing the land up to make it available to the sharecroppers. Now we know all the problems that are caused by sharecropping itself. Okay, that's a good place to stop this lecture. And I will be emailing everyone with instructions on how to access these new video lectures that I've done today. All right, I'll talk to you soon.